To fully understand the technological marvel of gameplay found in 2008's Dead Space, we first need to travel back to 2004, where the seeds of technological development were initially planted. Following the aftermath of the PS2 adventures that unfolded in the streets of Raccoon City, Capcom's Resident Evil 4 took the series in a fresh, new, and innovative direction. Fans were treated to a third-person, over-the-shoulder camera perspective which was revolutionary for its time. This of course was not new technology, but it was implemented so masterfully that it became a staple feature for games to come. In 2006, the creators of Dead Space took heavy inspiration from Resi 4 and all that it had accomplished. It's commonly stated that Dead Space is Resident Evil 4 but in space. While not entirely true, it is quite easy to see where this connection comes from, yet Dead Space still managed to create a mold of its own. This video is going to be broken down into multiple parts, the first of which will be an analysis of the initial gameplay along with its accompanying gameplay loop. Then a breakdown of the individual gameplay mechanics, followed by an in-depth analysis of the implementation of gameplay within the overarching story, though I will try to keep spoilers to a minimum. Dead Space is unique in the fact that the HUD is mainly non-existent. Isaac as a playable character exists entirely within the game world, with any and all HUD elements being a part of the natural story. Throughout the Ishimura, there are allusions to rigs, stasis, and all other gameplay elements that could be considered video gamey. This grounds the world through silently eliminating the disjunction between the gameplay and the game world. With the two uniting as one, the experience becomes more immersive than ever. This is something that not many people consider in their first playthroughs, since the diegetic HUD comes so naturally. Were it to be jarring enough, it would produce the reverse effect and remind the player that they are indeed playing a video game.
The first time the player gains control of Isaac, they're crammed in a tightly confined shuttle, with barely any space to move. Many people often find struggle within the task of simply exiting the ship. While some may criticize this as a poor introduction to a core gameplay mechanic, within a horror genre, this is actually a masterpiece in silent storytelling. The discombobulation the player first experiences is representative of the journey that follows them. It quickly establishes the idea that you will not be comfortable while playing this game. Many times, the initial moments of a horror game will slowly guide you while teaching you the main gameplay controls and mechanics, but not Dead Space. Dead Space is not a game with much initial support, and it's certainly not a game that will hold your hand. Isaac's being thrust into a situation he has no knowledge of, and so is the player. The immersion. Even when pop-ups do eventually appear, they're clunky, difficult to read, and somewhat awkward. This could very well just be a result of Dead Space being a 2008 title, but much like with the clunky movement, this works in the horror genre. Comfort often eliminates fear. If someone knows they're safe or has safety mechanics to fall back on, they're simply less scared. Dead Space not only destroys this safety net, but it eliminates it before it can even be created. This is further exemplified through the slaughter that ensues. While more of a story point, eliminating half the team is a smart move in the opening moments of a horror game. It establishes the idea that nobody is safe, and seeing as every NPC Isaac interacts with ends up dead by the end of the game, this idea holds true. The initial run down the hallway in the midst of a necromorph bloodbath only adds to the already incredibly high level of discomfort the player is feeling. The elevator is treated as a safe zone for the player after all the chaos has ended, yet the moment you step foot outside, a man can be heard screaming in the room directly next door. Isaac, a lowly engineer at this point, likely has no idea what to do next. Much like the player has been thrust into an uncomfortable, gameplay-oriented mess of an opening chapter. Immersion. Scribbled on the wall is a little message that has become an iconic image within the franchise. Alongside it is the first weapon granted to the player, the plasma cutter. Once picked up, the game displays a message describing the mechanics and uses of the weapon. Keep in mind, though, this message pops up in front of Isaac within the game world, not on an external menu off in the distance. On top of this, the concept of punching and stomping is introduced. These are two combat mechanics thrust upon the player with little to no practice provided. Though in attempting to utilize these abilities within the given space, it is apparent that the mechanics are just as clunky as the rest of the game. Isaac's punch is more of a momentous spin, and the stomp is a directionally challenged disaster. While these may be helpful in some combat situations, it's very clear to the player from the start that they are likely not the most efficient. The plasma cutter is a beast in its own right. Through an initial aim down sights, the player is treated to 3 lines protruding from the end of the weapon. A typical 4-line pronged symmetrical crosshair is non-existent. Instead, the game adopts the Resident Evil 4 approach of the laser sight guidance system. It would have been easy to slap 3 dots in the middle of the screen and simply utilize that as a stable aiming mechanic. This is even something that was added in Dead Space 2. Yet Dead Space 1 opts for a more grounded approach. Isaac wouldn't have 3 seemingly meaningless dots floating in front of him, so the player wouldn't either. It's immersion. Scattered about the room are multiple miscellaneous boxes and crates. There is no tutorial explaining how these boxes function. It is entirely up to the player to understand how these items work. The game employs a level of trust that respects the intelligence of the player to understand these concepts. It is now that Isaac is tasked with eliminating his first necromorph. A man can be heard screaming behind a nearby door. Is this a friend? A potential new ally, maybe? Well, any potential relationship with this character is quickly stripped away, as he is mauled to death by a nearby slasher. Turning its gaze, it's apparent that Isaac has just become its next target. The game employs no prompt to shoot, no quick-time dodging mechanics or cutscenes. It simply unleashes a necromorph on the player and expects you to perform. Dead Space will not hold your hand. A player moving too quick may only have the initial 10 shots at their disposal. Running out of ammo would mean certain death, which means every shot must count. Even methodical scavenging players who destroyed loot boxes for more ammo have barely enough to scrape by. Prior to the present moment, the player has no frame of reference for how to even take down a necromorph. Who's to say 10 shots is even enough? Who's to say this is another sprinting section where you run past the enemy? There is a level of uncertainty present that remains throughout the rest of the game. You never know which situation you'll need to be thrust in next, which means you always need to be aware. Once the player takes down the necromorph, they are given time to reflect. What happened leading up to the moment? What happened during the moment? It all happened so fast. And that's precisely the point. The game moves fast enough as is. Matching its speed only means further uncertainty and discomfort. This establishes a pace that will accompany the player until the final boss. Take your time, be mindful of your surroundings, and never grow complacent. Now that the proper combat mechanics have been established, we can discuss the rig. Resource integration gears, as known within the game world, is a method of conveying information to the player while maintaining the absence of the HUD. To keep in line with the immersion and grounded atmosphere the game desires, the rig is utilized to display health, stasis, audio logs, text logs, the map, and the player's inventory. Logistically speaking, the rig is a built-in part of the engineering suit Isaac dons throughout the whole game. This provides an in-game explanation as to why it's always with him, which adds to the realism and the immersion. The rig can be broken down into 3 core aspects: the health, the stasis, and the display. To begin, we'll analyze the health. In Dead Space, health is measured through the green bars fashioned on the back of Isaac's suit. These are both numerically valued and color-coded to properly display Isaac's health in any given situation. Through the game's upgrading system, which we'll discuss later, Isaac can gain more bars on his rig. More bars simply equate to more health. Along with this, the bars are color-coded to display a general health level to the player. A green health bar describes a healthy player, whereas a yellow or even red health bar describes a player in need of help. This method of display is so masterfully implemented that I'm surprised more games haven't tried to replicate it. Yet even this has an explanation for existing in the game world. Multiple signs and messages can be seen around the Ishimura, showcasing the camaraderie between shipmates. Many of these advise checking up on other people's rigs to ensure their safety, which makes sense in the setting of an industrial mining ship such as the Ishimura. Moving on, we have the stasis mechanic. Stasis is both a combat and puzzle mechanic used in-game to slow down other objects. This in turn can also be used on the necromorphs to gain a tactical advantage or reinforce a hasteful retreat. This mechanic is a strong balance to the raw speed and agility portrayed by the necromorphs. Stasis is the first instance of safety and comfort for the player, which reinforces the idea that they can beat the necromorphs. With such an uncomfortable opening, it would be easy for a player to turn the game off and play something they'd enjoy, so it's a smart idea giving the player a leg up early on. Though it is small, it's effective in enhancing the overall player experience. Stasis is measured by the semicircle up and to the right of the health bar. Much like health, through the upgrade stations, many aspects of stasis can be improved, such as the number of shots and the duration of the freezing period. Much like everything else in the game, stasis is a masterfully implemented mechanic. It adds a whole new level of skill to what may have been a standard combat loop. Not only are you fighting on multiple fronts, but you are also fighting multiple enemies on different timescales. Some fast, some slow, the choice is yours, and that's a genius idea. Stasis does a whopping 0 damage to the enemies, yet it is one of the most useful combat mechanics in the entire game. That is a true testament to how refined and masterfully crafted the combat system is in this game. Finally, we have the overall display. While not too large of a gameplay feature, the use of a rig and in-game displays continues to boost the immersion and repel the use of a HUD. Video clips and calls from your group will display in front of Isaac for him to watch in real time.
What the hell is happening down there? What happened to the shuttle?
That was our ride home. It's the only way off the ship.
Kendra.
No, Hammond! This changes everything!
Just let me think. Can you access the command computer?
Text logs will deploy with backgrounds and information on the authors who wrote them in front of Isaac as well. Along with this, the inventory displays in real time, even allowing Isaac to move around and navigate the inventory at the same time through the utilization of both the D-pad and the analog stick. These little details add up to create a fully immersive in-game experience. It's also worth noting that all gun-related HUD elements are shown off within the game world as well, with ammo counts displaying above the weapon when aiming. With the player's eyes already focused on the crosshair trying to determine where they'll aim next, having the ammo count be just under it was an extraordinarily intelligent move by the game developers. A quick glance and you have all the information you need to know.
With
the HUD elements established and discussed, we can move into the core combat systems. The combat of Dead Space revolves around a strategic dismemberment system pertaining to the limbs of a given enemy. This method of killing is introduced as early as, and most prominently in Chapter 1. Scribbles on the walls and in-game audio logs detail Ishimura survivors describing their success in dismembering the necromorphs as a method of killing them.
This is Benson, Tram Engineering. We think we figured it out. Smith killed one. Listen, forget about shooting him in the body. You gotta cut off the limbs. Grab a cutter, anything like that. Cut him apart!
Isaac, be careful. Shooting them in the body didn't seem to work. Go for the limbs. Dismember them. That should do the job.
Conserve ammo by dismembering enemy limbs and doing extra damage.
It would have been relatively easy to slap a headshot hitbox on each individual necromorph and call it a day, but Dead Space strives to be innovative and differentiate itself from other works of its time. In many cases, shooting the head off a necromorph can be more detrimental than not, causing them to flail and swing wildly. As such, the core combat systems many people find themselves falling into is a few shots to the leg and concentrated shots to the arms until the necromorph is dead. This simple gameplay loop works on multiple levels. From a visual perspective, limb dismemberment is a genius way of determining the health of a given enemy. Generally speaking, more limbs equate to more health. This allows the player to quickly recognize the health of an enemy without the use of a health bar. This also adds a level of strategy in determining which enemy should be the player's primary target while temporarily leaving other enemies in the background. It's also worth noting how well this mechanic intertwines with the stasis mechanic. With all these tools at the player's disposal, the battles in-game turn more into strategic puzzles as opposed to mindless shooting galleries. Limb dismemberment is something I'm extremely excited for in the new Dead Space remake. I'll leave a link into the developer videos that showcase the skinning techniques and limb dismemberment showcases on the next generation consoles. It's really good stuff. I'll be tackling each individual necromorph in a more in-depth analysis in some other videos, so for now we'll just be looking at the group as a whole. As Isaac grows and gains upgrades throughout the game, so too do the necromorphs. Tougher enemies are introduced as the game progresses, which allows for the player to never grow completely complacent in their killing abilities. This culminates in the game's final level, where nearly every enemy in the game is featured, and it's amazing. The systems used by the necromorphs are nothing short of spectacular too. Using vents to traverse the Ishimura is an extraordinarily smart way of keeping the player on their toes, as vents lather the walls of the ship from beginning to end. I believe it's also worth noting the inclusion of telekinesis. Though more of a puzzle mechanic as opposed to combat, it still has its uses in the midst of battle, but some are more obvious than others. Scattered throughout the Ishimura are red glowing canisters. These explode when shot, yet can also be thrown through the utilization of the kinesis module. Obviously, firing explosive canisters is a good tool to have in your arsenal. The most prominent uses that come to mind are when dealing with swarmers or guardians. The other primary use of telekinesis within the combat of Dead Space is a lesser known and overshadowed aspect of the game. To many people surprised that have already experienced Dead Space 2, kinesis can be used to throw objects at enemies and harm them in Dead Space 1. Dismembered limbs or sharp objects around the Ishimura can be hurled towards enemies, damaging them, though the mechanic is extremely finicky and doesn't provide much feedback. Aside from a minor stun, there is no clear sign of damage taken unless the limb is dismembered, which typically takes multiple kinesis throws. This leads many people to simply believe that this mechanic only exists in the sequel and beyond, yet it is still very much prominent here, just not the primary focus. I'll dive deeper into how each individual weapon exists within the core combat in another video, but for now, this is the general primary gameplay loop of the first Dead Space. Methodical, strategic, and satisfying. Stores are found all throughout the Ishimura, appearing as early as Chapter 1. These use the currency of credits, which is an item that can be dropped by enemies or picked up off the ground on the ship. The system supports a basic trading economy, where each item has a set value and can be traded for credit. These items include ammunition, power nodes, suit upgrades, health packs, stasis packs, weapons, and oxygen canisters. You can trade in your own items for credits to spend on other items too. This means it's not entirely a bad idea to pick up an item even if you have no use for it, so long as the inventory space allows it. The store operates on a schematic system. You simply find a schematic for a given item and bring it to any nearby store. This then allows Isaac to purchase this item. Firstly, it encourages exploration, since the player never quite knows if they're missing an important schematic. It also assists in aiding with the pacing of the overall gameplay, as better guns and suits are logically unlocked later in the game, thus supporting any balancing issues. It's worth noting that each suit upgrade provides more inventory slots, which creates another incentive to explore the Ishimura. The store also supports a save feature, which allows players to store items they may not need at the moment, but might need later on. This helps with ensuring the player has total control with how they manage their inventory. They never feel like they're wasting space through selling items they have too much of, since there's always the option to just store it instead. This is yet another layer to the already complicated experience that Dead Space so perfectly crafted. These types of risk-reward situations appear all throughout the game, and are great for keeping with the horror and suspense that you don't know exactly what to expect. The bench serves as a method for upgrading the player's gear throughout Dead Space. It employs a currency system that utilizes rare power nodes found across the Ishimura. Upgrades include weapons, health, oxygen, and stasis. Having all of these core gameplay elements linked back to the same currency system was an incredibly smart decision, as it forces players to think about what playstyle they'd like to work with. A defensive player might focus strictly on health upgrades, only upgrading weapons when absolutely necessary. They might also focus on improving their oxygen or stasis supply, so that they can be better prepared for any encounter they find themselves in. A more offensive player might focus entirely on their weapons, only upgrading their health when they have power nodes to spare. This duality provides a layered experience that tailors the game for multiple playstyles. It also massively improves the replay value, as there is not nearly enough power nodes in the game to fully upgrade all of Isaac's gear. The already strategic and methodical combat system is only further improved through the masterfully crafted upgrade system. It's also worth noting that the in-game store does cross over with the bench to one degree, that being that power nodes are purchasable from the store for 10,000 credits. This adds another layer of resource management in upgrading the gear or obtaining equipment for the gear. The next gameplay element we'll discuss is Zero Gravity. Zero Gravity falls within a tricky spot in the first Dead Space. It simultaneously manages to be one of Dead Space's most standout features, yet also one of the most clunky game mechanics in recent history. I'm going to dive deeper into the atmosphere of these sections in my Atmosphere of Dead Space video, which should be out relatively soon. But for now, we'll be tackling Zero Gravity from a strictly gameplay perspective. Zero Gravity typically works under one main idea, that being that there is no proper sense of direction. Once you enter the room, up and down no longer exist. Isaac is able to move freely to any object the eye can see. The player navigates these rooms through a somewhat clunky mechanic that has him diving across an open area to stand on nearby surfaces. This is an extremely neat concept on paper that holds a lot of gameplay potential, yet the way Dead Space handles it is subpar to say the least. Isaac is typically fumbling his way around the room, hopelessly attempting jumps that may or may not work. I'm aware that I praised this somewhat clunky mechanics of the movement in Dead Space earlier, but this is too much even for me. Whereas the controls were manageable at the start, some of these sections are borderline unplayable for inexperienced players. It says a lot when the hardest part about your puzzle sections is simply moving around the damn room. This is most prominent in Chapter 6, when you need to find a Weezer in the Zero Gravity room. I've played through this game at least 25 times and still don't know my way around this mess of a level. However, I do give the developers respect, since this is a key issue that was rebuilt from the ground up in the sequels. Dead Space 2 took the Zero Gravity sections to all new heights, and it seems even in the Dead Space 1 remake they're doing away with this clunky design. Despite the clunky controls, I will say that combat in this section is quite fun once you get the hang of it. The enemies primarily consist of lurkers and leapers, which adds a fun contrast to the slasher-filled corridors and the rest of the Ishimura. I wish this was something that was built on more, as it would have been interesting to see something like brutes flying around in these sections, though I do understand this may have been a bit goofy. While this likely could have been intertwined with the Zero Gravity section, I decided to make Zero Oxygen a section of its own, simply because of how innovative this feature is in relevance to the tension and horror the gameplay establishes. Routing this analysis back to the fear and horror aspect of Dead Space, the limited oxygen sections serve as a perfect tension builder in otherwise bland areas of the Ishimura. It implants the idea that you are on a strict timetable that will kill you if not properly managed. This alone is enough to stress players out, so complicating the matter with the inclusion of various necromorphs is enough to panic the player into a spiral. The game initially has these sections as peaceful transitional moments that guide Isaac from one location to another, but very quickly after that first wall of slasher is thrown at Isaac on his way back during Chapter 2, introducing the player to the idea that even in the vacuum of space you are not safe. This is not a comfort zone. The raw tension built through simply putting the player on a timer is immaculate, and serves as an excellent tension builder. It's because of this that I believe one of the best moments in the entire game revolves around this strict timetable. That moment being the hull walk in Chapter 4, when Isaac is dodging the flying asteroids on the side of the Ishimura. This is a section I don't think is talked about nearly enough and doesn't get enough praise. The other aspect of these vacuum sections is the oxygen resupply canisters. These are items that take up inventory slots that will refill Isaac's oxygen supply. I love these. Though I prefer Dead Space 2 to Dead Space 1, I was never a fan of how the suit had a built-in massive timer for oxygen. I felt it took away from much of the tension within the game and allowed for Zero Gravity sections to become safer places. Though this could be because Dead Space 2 is already action-oriented enough, so it's understandable. But in Dead Space 1, the oxygen supply is limited. Vital power nodes must be spent at upgrade stations to gain a few more measly seconds of air, which puts into question whether or not it's even worth it. This adds a lot more emphasis to the oxygen canisters and provides one of the survival horror elements that is integrated so perfectly in this game. While I consider Dead Space more of an action survival game as opposed to survival horror, I appreciate the level of inventory management this item adds when considering what to take in your loadout. It also helps that the player can never quite guess when they're going to need the oxygen canister. In the medical deck of the Ishimura, you seemingly wouldn't need a supply of oxygen, yet this is where the mechanic is featured most prominently. Then there's a mission titled Dead Space, which has space in the name, yet there is not a single zero oxygen location in the entire level. This level of uncertainty and inability to properly prepare keeps the player guessing and is perfect at maintaining the tension. There are oxygen refill stations around the ship, though these are in seemingly random spots and more of a gamble rather than something that can be comfortably relied on. I think another fun detail that's worth noting is that the flamethrower doesn't actually work in these sections. The player will be prompted with an icon suggesting it can't fire whenever attempted. The logistical explanation is likely due to the fact that flames need oxygen to survive, which obviously isn't present in a vacuum, though the in-game fuel source for this weapon is said to contain an oxidizer, meaning it should still be able to fire. This is likely why this feature was not present in the follow-up game. The majority of the gameplay found in Dead Space has already been discussed, though there is one gimmick that we are yet to talk about: the drag scenes. These moments are rare within the game, only happening 4 times to my knowledge, those times being 3 tentacles on the Ishimura and the hive mind boss at the end of the game. It sees the player sliding around helplessly attempting to shoot a target with the most abhorrent control scheme possible, yet I kind of like it. I feel it adds a sense of discomfort that builds the atmosphere, and since it only appears a few times throughout the game, it's nothing major that drags down the overall experience. Another detail I want to touch on is the kinesis puzzles. These are small and somewhat mindless, but they provide slower moments in the game. They are typically found in odd, peaceful areas that require simple movements, though there are high-intensity situations where these puzzles are also present. It's something small, but it's a fun, enjoyable side task that I thought was worth including. Turret sections are also featured, but only twice. There's not too much to say about these other than they suck. They aren't large enough to drag the game down though, but it is unfortunate that one of the 3 bosses in the game is an arcade-style turret shooter. The final sub-feature we'll discuss is the difficulty level. I am of the strong belief that a large majority of games should be confined to a single difficulty level. This allows the developers to methodically calculate aspects of their game to the finest degree possible. The gameplay featured in this video was on medium difficulty simply because I needed to acquire footage in a fast manner, and I've played through this game more times than I can count. For new players, I strongly recommend playing on the hard difficulty, as it establishes the Necromorph to be more of a true threat, which falls in line with the narrative the game is portraying. It also hinders the player's use of ammo and health through less drops, which further supports the idea of a desperate attempt at survival. I feel that the easy and medium difficulty are simply too easy to accurately showcase the horror this game is going for, so for a proper Dead Space experience, play the game on hard. There is also a hidden 4th difficulty unlocked after beating the game. This difficulty serves as a new game plus for players that want to replay the story with all the required upgrades and equipment from the previous playthrough. The enemies found inhabiting this difficulty are stronger and tend to dodge and maneuver around Isaac's shots more often. They are generally smarter and present more of a challenge to the player. Drops are also scarcer and provide less resources to the player. This difficulty strongly improves the replay value of the game and enhances the overall experience. Along with a new difficulty, completing the game also provides the player with a myriad of other valuables and extras, such as credits, power nodes, a new suit, and some additional story logs. The difficulty of Dead Space is something I believe was implemented quite well. The initial playthrough is strong, yet the impossible mode makes repeat playthroughs even stronger, which supports the timeless nature of this game. An often overlooked detail in the first Dead Space is the fluidity and cohesion of the story's unity with the gameplay. From the start of a level to the end, there is not a single cut in the gameplay, and were the tram loading screens to be removed, the game would nearly be one continuous shot from start to finish. This is something Dead Space 2 built on, having only a few times the screen ever cuts, which typically is when Isaac gets knocked out, which is surprisingly often. This aids in supporting the overall immersion the game is going for. Isaac never catches a break, and neither will the player. I also think it's funny how the one time the player and Isaac can relax is when one of the most infamous jump scares occurs. I won't spoil when this occurs, but I'm sure most of the people that have played the game know what I'm talking about. With the next generation technology of the modern day gaming consoles and PCs, it's been said that the Dead Space remake will be one continuous shot from beginning to end. So while God of War may have popularized the one-shot gameplay, Dead Space strongly assisted in planting the seeds. That about wraps up the gameplay analysis of Dead Space. A majority of the game still holds up extraordinarily well, minus some turret sections and some of the zero-gravity mechanics. Though it is a 13-year-old game, I still do strongly recommend purchasing it and playing through on the hardest difficulty. Turn off the lights, get a good pair of headphones, and you're in for a great experience. This is a new channel, and as such, I'm still getting my footing on the whole video experience. But I do plan on releasing more in-depth analysis videos soon, though I'm currently waist-deep in university, so forgive me if they're not released in the timeliest fashion. These will likely be more focused videos on specific aspects of the game as opposed to the broad concept that is reviewing 12 chapters of gameplay. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. This took absolutely ages to make, so any support is greatly appreciated, and it'll let me know if you guys are a fan of this style of video. If you have any suggestions or ideas, leave them in a comment below and I'll try and get back to you. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in another Dead Space analysis.